and I would like to introduce projection. I'd like to introduce our president-elect, and what in Hindi we call Sutradhar of today's program, and none other than my brother Dr. Vinay Kumar, who is a man of literature, man for literature, and man with literature, and he's come with us this task force for this beginning of first program on literature and psychiatry, and he is the force to bring Dr. Salman Akhtar and Dr. Anirudh sir for on this platform to give us the words of wisdom. And I don't think Dr. Vinay Kumar needs any introduction with this in this gathering. He is a poet and author, and his poetry and his book, which has been much talked about, is Yakshini, and his regular feature on mental health, Manovid, was regular, but after COVID, there has been some problem. We hope that this Manovid continues again. And he is a winner of IMA Ramachandran and Murthy Award, Ayodhya Prasad Khatri Award for 2014 Hindi bestseller Ek Manochikitsak Ke Notes. And I welcome you, Dr. Vinay Kumar sir, to set the context of today's program and make a beginning on the literature and psychiatry. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm really overwhelmed on this occasion because my life started as a poet first and became psychiatrist later. And when this year we decided to start a task force covering common issues between literature and psychiatry, probably I was more than happy. So let me take you to the area how things started. In IPS, we had our past president, Professor J.S. Neki. J.S. Neki was a unique person. We all know him. He was a great poet, Academy Award winner poet. Probably only psychiatrist in India who got Academy Award for poetry. One Academy Award has gone to Dr. Mohan Agashe for theatre, but Dr. Neki got Academy Award for Punjabi poetry. And we all know the kind of research and the kind of contributions he did for IPS. Another person I remember in this context is Professor Anirudh, who always insisted on having some extracurricular things with all students going to PGI. And he was a very sincere reader. Whenever I was editing Manovid Digest, and it's closed now and we were planning to start again, he always contributed something to that. And whatever we published, he always appreciated and communicated, yes, ye hua, ye galat hua. In tradition, we have Dr. Salman Akhtar, 18 books of poetry, English, Urdu, Hindi, 3 languages. Apart from that, he has edited a book of poetry between hours, and that is a collection of poems of psychotherapists. The person who are related to psychoanalysis, psychotherapy. Unique book. Another person we have with us, Dr. Anirudh. Unsafe Asylum, and 2.5 Rivers, 2 books. To my mind, I have read all these 2 books, and I know how sincere and how great a writer he is, and how acclaimed. In all many literary festivals, we see him discussing, talking to readers and all, and signing books. Few names we have in South: Dr. Rabindranath in Madurai and Dr. Mohan Raj in Chennai. They have written novels and they are writing. Next step in IPS was setting up a task force on creativity and mental health in 2018. This was done when I was Honorary General Secretary of IPS. And in 2022, we have started Literature and Psychiatry. I know this era of biological psychiatry, and people will ask, why this literature and psychiatry in the era of biological psychiatry? We are talking about molecules, we are talking about receptors, we are going to macro levels, circuits, and you are talking about literature, which is too subjective. So there is a mismatch. But there are answers. We diagnose our patients on the basis of stories, not just information. This is the common link. And I would like to borrow a sentence from Dr. Salman Akhtar that the miseries of our patients are caused by stories. So there are stories and stories and stories. And if we talk about literature, literature is all about stories. Even poetry carries lots of stories. Then this is important because writers are opinion makers. When Foucault wrote about madness and civilization, and so people started talking on that line. All intellectuals talked on what Foucault suggested. When Chekhov wrote Ward Number 6, all intellectuals started talking about the madness is a kind of thing that society is the main reason. So society is the basically culprit, and the person suffers due to society. So this was a basic idea. So there was no biological psychiatry there. So biological psychiatry we are talking about. Society is not talking about that. Society talked on the basis of what Chekhov wrote in Ward Number 6. And so this is one reason, because they are opinion makers. If writers start writing something, they can change the scenario. I remember I'll share few small things, that there was a story written by a current Hindi writer in which he labeled somebody as schizophrenia. All symptoms were of depression, and that patient commits suicide. And he says that due to schizophrenia, he committed suicide. I commented on that, and there was argument, and he became angry, and he said, you people are trying to infuse lots of wrong scientific information to us. So I believe there is a need for sane stories, scientifically sane stories. In Hindi, we have one very good novel by Manisha Kulshrestha, Swapn Pash. She is about a prodigy artist coming from a tormented family, and she commits suicide. But in a very small span of life, she does wonderful paintings, and it's a beautiful novel. And the book has been written after lots of research. So if somebody does research, if somebody tries to understand the thing and then write, things will be different. So we need scientifically sane stories. And another thing, we need to learn from things from horse's mouth. In Hindi, we have only one book, Maine Mandu Nahi Dekha. Dr. Kala will tell us more about that. It was written by Swadesh Deepak. He was professor of English in Jalandhar, Ambala. He was in Ambala, and he suffered from what he suffered. It's difficult to tell because the kind of story he narrates tells about that. Definitely there was symptoms of mood and schizophrenia could be labeled as, if we have to label, we can label as schizoaffective. But the thing is, 7 years in his life was very bad phase, and he attempted suicide. He was admitted to PGI, and after recovery, he wrote a beautiful book titled Maine Mandu Nahi Dekha. If you go through books, the way he describes his illness, so clear picture, hallucination and everything. So vividly he described. And there is a method how things have evolved. And most importantly, when he writes about psychiatrists, Dr. Verma, Dr. Kulhara, Dr. Avasthi, the way he writes, and if you read the sentences, you will feel that, oh, Dr. Verma is talking, Dr. Avasthi is talking, Dr. Kulhara is talking. Their personality is also like that he has depicted. So we need such stories. One poem I would like to mention. There is a poet, Rati Saxena, she lives in Kerala, and she edits one magazine, international magazine titled Kritya. She got some poem from somebody on internet, and the name of the poet was Peria Peresia, and she was informed that she committed suicide in a mental hospital, probably in Iran. Things are not clear, but as on personal communication, she told that the story is from Iran. She fell in love with some senior poet, and she never met. She was hospitalized. Psychiatrists are here, we can understand what kind of delusion there was. And she was hospitalized, and there she writes small letters, so small things. And some of one friend got all those letters, and she translated to English, put on website, and when she committed suicide. And the whole thing came to India through Rati Saxena. And this poem is so touching, so touching. I remember when Dr. Edenwick read this poem, उन्होंने कहा कि क्या कविता आपकी कहाँ से आई, हिला के रख दिया मुझे. I was tearful. ये विक साहब की लाइन थी. तो ये important है. This will lead to, this will sensitize us. So a true psychiatrist must acknowledge the contribution of literature that has already made it. I'm not going in detail because we have to listen to our two great speakers. So you can keep changing. With mythology, it's a huge treasure across cultures, all cultures. And when we talk about mythology, all mythology is literature, full of metaphors, full of meanings. And mythology is has played and is playing and will play more role, has given more contribution, and will give more contribution than all of us. It has shaped our mind, our culture, and it's shaping. And in times of need, it will help. I'm not going in detail, but just I'll mention 4 functions of mythology, which Joseph Campbell, basically he was a literature, but he devoted his whole life in studying mythology. This name was again introduced to me by Professor Edenwick. So he says, mythology serves 4 functions. Mystic, because our universe is wonderful, mysterious. It connects us to universe. So the person who is lost in this world about his existence and other things, he feels connected. If he goes through those stories, he feels connected. Another is cosmological. Campbell says the myths are sacred openings through which inexhaustible energy of cosmos pour in cultural manifestation. So myths are songs of universe. Number 3, sociological. It maintains social order. It sounds dogmatic, but we must realize that myths, all mythological stories have not made in a day. There is a long history, and myths are being made even today. Gandhi, Che Guevara, these are all myths, and Subhash Chandra Bose has become again a myth. So Rabindranath Tagore is becoming a myth. So lots of myths we are creating. So there is always chance to modify. Story of Dronacharya has been told and retold and retold. Another function is pedagogic. It tells us how to live life under given circumstances. Gita, counseling, psychotherapy. We all discuss. And hardcore facts, I'm not going to discuss Sigmund Freud, Oedipus complex. From Shakespeare, from mythology, and from Shakespeare, he has got lots of information. I think you all know, I'm not going in that detail. But thing is, description of OCD, Lady Macbeth's story. It's all blood, everywhere blood, and she keeps washing hand again and again. Othello syndrome, trauma and PTSD. Dr. Kala will discuss the thing in detail. So I love this quote the statement by Freud. Everywhere I go, I find a poet has been there before me. If Freud says this has a meaning. Literature is useful for understanding psychopathology, for stigma reduction, and therapy. Just go through these names. Do you think, can we say that, can we ridicule these people? We have to honor, we will salute all these names. I'm not reading these names. Therapeutics, we all know, already told, books change us. And writing helps in recovery. Dr. Salman Akhtar will talk in detail about poetry therapy and all, but I'll just mention case of John Stuart Mill. He was English philosopher and famous for his contribution to utilitarianism. What happened in his life, because his father was very strict father, and he wanted to make his son a kind of learning machine. And by the age of 8, this Stuart was aware of entire European history. He was taught Greek apart from English, and mathematics and what not. By the age of 14, 16, 17, 18, he was almost in his mind a concept of utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham was his teacher. Jeremy Bentham told him that basically the principle of that philosophy is that you have to keep things in order, all institutions, everything, and so society has to be just and lawful, and everybody will be happy. So he was carrying this in mind. What happened? His father gave him sabbatical for some time at around age of 16, 17. He went to France. He came in contact with natural beauty. Then he came back and he was realizing that I'm missing something. After a few years, 1 or 2 years, he started thinking that, okay, if society becomes lawful and just, will I be happy? That will be pleasure in me. There will be pleasure in me and society and everywhere. He was not finding answer, and in one autumn, he felt severe depression, including suicidal ideation. But since he was a learning machine, lots of data was fed. So he started thinking and thinking and thinking and thinking, and he related the pleasure with the things, the natural beauty he saw in France, and then he started reading Wordsworth poetry. And Wordsworth poetry changed him. He came out of depression, and he realized that meaningful life is a combination of lawful and just society and natural beauty, emotions, love. So, with these few words, I say thank you. Let us move forward. There is a project. We will do literature search and depiction of psychological problems in Indian literature. We will organize interactive sessions with authors so that scientifically sane stories produced. And also, we will try to develop some info literary product. With these few words, thank you very much. Let's move forward.
Should I begin now? Yeah. Let the chairperson take over now.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Eric. We will take over now.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I was given some papers of introduction for Dr. Kala and for Salman Akhtar. I think I won't go into that because enough has been said, and we should not extend the preamble and come to the crux of the this afternoon.
Since our second chairperson is not coming, I invite Dr. Nimesh Desai to join. And
you chair from there.
He's on a chair.
He's on a chair. Okay. So let me begin with you, Salman. Salman is talking about, you know all the topic. All of you know the topic. And after he finishes his talk, we'll have 15 minutes of question answer. Then we'll come to Dr. Kala. It's okay?
Yeah. Okay. I'm speaking there, but I'm not saying. Okay. Well, thank you for having me here. And to those people in the audience who are listening, here is the situation. I actually require two things from you. Because, like breastfeeding is not the only activity only of the mother. The baby also has to suck. Same way, teaching is not only the activity of a teacher. The student has to be serious too, right? So I'm going to require two things. And they are kind of contradictory, but such is life. I don't want you to be too serious. I do not want you to be too serious. And listen to me seriously. You'll be lost because I'm lost. So please do not take what I'm saying, and some of people are already not taking anything I'm saying seriously, which is kind of encouraging. You can see my words are already having an effect. So I think that please don't take me too seriously. No, that's not a good way of assimilating all this. I think about 79.2% seriousness is enough. Then you will get what I'm talking about. The second comment I have is, please do take me seriously. This is not a joke. This is a serious matter. Those are my two requirements from you. With that agreement, gentlemanly agreement between us, I'll say a few things. First, what is psychotherapy? Psychotherapy is two people. One person, there is a problem to be solved. Hopefully, the patient is sicker than the doctor, hopefully, so that there's a problem. There are two people. There is a discourse, which is predominantly verbal, although some non-verbal elements are also there. And there is an attempt at establishing a common agenda to solve that problem through verbal, mostly verbal, but some non-verbal discourse. There's a mystery to be solved. Some surprises happen, some new things are learned, and what was unfathomable becomes fathomable. What was hideous and idiosyncratic becomes shared and mutual. What was useless, nonetheless troubling and distressing, becomes less distressing, less troublesome, and somewhat useful and such. That is called psychotherapy. What is poetry? Poetry, there's one person, but we are not sure that there's only one person. Because that one person has other people inside. A person is himself or herself deconstructed and destructured into multiple parts. So it looks like there's one person from surface, but there's a problem, a mystery that has to be solved. And there is a discourse that is predominantly verbal, although non-verbal elements are also there. And through this process, what was unfathomable becomes fathomable, what was unclear becomes clear, what was not understandable, space occupying and useless becomes somewhat useful and less troubling, and what was private and idiosyncratic and hideous becomes commonly shared and mutually enjoyable. The poet, as Freud says in his very good paper, 1908, Creative Writers and Daydreaming, poet offers an aesthetic bribe to the audience to then buy into the idea, and what was idiosyncratic now turns into mutual. So you can already see how much overlap is in the two processes. Both processes are a structured, organized form of discourse. Both processes have something to do very deep, though unclear, with the human body. Both processes have to do with things that are not known, but need to be known. Both processes have something to do with solving a problem at hand. The poet has a problem, which appears to the poet in the form of a movement of an emotion. See, writing poetry has three movements. First movement, which is passive, you can create it. You ask people who write, they will tell you, or maybe it's also in fiction. I don't have experience with fiction. Maybe Anirudh will say that first movement is that you begin to feel something. Something happens. Something happens. I began to feel something. Something overtook me. A mood came over me. This movement is a passive one. Second is, then I picked up a pen and I said, I'll scribble something, I'll write. And the third movement is, then I looked at it, I sort of gave it a better order. And then finally, one day I even understood what I wrote. Seamus Heaney said that in writing poetry, the movement is always from delight to wisdom. And the word delight and the word wisdom are both also hyperbolic in the style of a poet. Actually meaning from an emotion to knowledge, to unknown to known. This is the essential part of the poetry. A visual metaphor will be that there's an ocean. From the ocean, a seashell is out, and a 4-year-old girl picks up the seashells, runs, and her mother is sitting, reading a book. She gives the shell to the mother cleans it, puts a thread, makes it a necklace. A, B, C. Seashell coming out, girl picking it up, mother cleaning it up. That is the movement in writing poetry. That is also the movement in conducting psychotherapy. The patient, on which we have no control. The patient says something on which we have no control. And we are, in a way, passive recipient to it. We open the door, patient comes in. Where the patient begins from, we don't know. What the patient is going to say, we don't know. So passive material comes in. The child, 4-year-old girl in us, so to speak, picks up that material, and the mother in us gives it a shape. And then we share the necklace. And she can wear it sometimes, I can wear it sometimes. Now, this is about, I've taken out of 79% seriousness, about 37 already. So relax, please. This is enough seriousness. This is enough seriousness. Now listen to a poem. The poem goes like this. I love trees. I love Acha, then, so it's not about trees and it's not about ice cream. So what is it about?
Feelings and the emotions.
Yes.
The person is telling about how she feels about the environment or the whatever inner feelings, but she's relating it.
See, no, he, in this case, he is my poem. In this case, hormone से बदल भी जाता आदमी, लेकिन हाँ चलिए. अच्छा, then
Mostly being related to the inner emotions.
About what? Yes, inner emotions about
how the mother treats it.
Very interesting. Go.
How
Yeah.
the mother treated the child or something related.
No. That's too generic. That's like saying, I'm going to India. That doesn't mean anything. Which part of India, right? So no. What is this about? How about you? You seem to be understanding when I was talking, but now we'll find out whether you were understanding or you seem to be understanding. What do you think? You see, this is what we have to do if we are going to be serious. Yeah, it's about people, louder, people's likes and dislikes. What does that tree has to do with that? What is the difference? Okay, let me help you. I'm older than you. I'll help you. What is the difference between a tree and ice cream? Tell me 3 differences. ये तो 3 डिफरेंस ट्री खाया कभी आपने? ट्री तो खाया नहीं है. अच्छा, तो अब बताओ 3 डिफरेंस. What's that? Ice cream is edible, tree is not edible. Good. 1, 2 more. Okay. ट्री आइसक्रीम भी भगवान ही की बनाई हुई है, खासतौर पे अच्छी हो तो. What's that? Okay. Not bad. कोई टेक्सचर में फर्क है? Is there a difference in texture? Yes, ice cream is soft and tree. Interesting. And if ice cream is doing well, it becomes less and less because you keep eating it. If tree is doing well, it goes up. Yeah. Look, okay, enough. Okay, enough. This poem, to my mind, please understand, I wrote this poem. And the last phrase, I love ice cream, was written by me. The remaining I wrote. Do you see the distinction? All of it I wrote. I love ice cream was written by me. That came passively. The first piece was written actively. Right? In that moment, it's like an epilepsy. In that moment, you are possessed by the creative process and it drives you by itself. The poem, as I wrote, I didn't know what it meant. But I liked it. It's sort of amusing and interesting. But as I looked, what is this saying about trees? He loves this kind, this kind, this kind, this kind, this kind. इसका क्या मतलब हुआ? He doesn't love this kind, this kind, this kind, this kind, this kind. तो इसका मतलब है कि इसका love जो tree का है, his love for trees is very conditional. It demands many things. और ice cream का love? I love ice cream. It is a boy's struggle, a man's struggle to come to terms with his father while being peaceful with his mother. That's what the poem is about. This is how we are going to do. If this shit is going to work today, this is what we are going to do. You see what I'm saying? The cross currents between poetry and psychotherapy. Obviously, there can be a simplest and concrete one that you recommend a particular poem, or you recommend a particular line, you recommend read a particular line. Direct use of poetry in psychotherapy. We'll talk about that. That's not to be looked down upon. That's also interesting. The direct use of poetry. ये आपको समझ में आया माँ बाप का फर्क? Did you follow the father and mother difference? Really है जोक कर रही हैं आप? अल्लाह का शुक्र. अच्छा. So now, direct use of poetry. That's one thing, and I'll give you some examples of that. Poetic way of talking, that's a separate thing. But more important than either of these, and I'll give examples of each. The direct use of poetry, the poetic use of way of talking to the patient. I'll give you examples. These are less important. What is more important is the poetic way of listening. The poetic way of listening. Because listening to prose and listening to poetry are two different things. They're not same listening. Here is a line. You tell me. What is sadder than a train stopped in rain? Me. What is sadder than a train stopped in rain? बहुत आधी बोतल विस्की पी सकता आदमी इस पे, नहीं? अगर हम आप साथ हो तो शायद पूरी बोतल हो जाए। कम से कम आधी बोतल विस्की की इस लाइन पे पी जा सकती है। What is sadder than a train stopped in rain? What do you think it means? What do you think it means? I mean, in prose, it would not make any sense, right? Because, I mean, there are hundreds of things sadder. A child being abused, a child being orphaned, a man being beaten, a woman being raped, somebody's son dying, or, there are hundreds of things that are sadder. So in logic, it wouldn't make any sense. In prose, which is, discursive and logical and time-oriented and such, it wouldn't make any sense. So you cannot listen to poetry and prose by the same rule. You have to listen differently. So, मुश्किल सवाल है, आसान सवाल. A man comes up to you in psychotherapy, first session, and he says, Dr. Saab, I want to tell you one thing. I am 66 years old, and if I properly calculate when I lived in college, when I lived in high school, then I was married, I got divorced. And if I calculate, I'm noticing that I've lived 22 years by myself, alone. What's he saying? What's he telling you? एक प्रोज में बताइए, एक पोएम में बताइए. अगर प्रोज में बोल रहा है तो क्या बोल रहा है, और पोइट्री में बोल रहा है तो क्या बोल रहा है. अगर ये फर्क नहीं सीखेंगे तो भी लेक्चर बेकार हो गया. हाँ.
Even in the companion of his wife and even in the companion of his friends during the college time, he was lonely most of the time.
Good. You're getting better. You're already improving. That's a very good sign. That's a very good sign. Yeah. That on surface, if we listen to the logical construction of this man's revelation, we say this is a man, who has difficulty with relationships. This is a man who's not made up his mind whether he live in this world or be out of this world, whether he be related to people or not related to people, whether he prefers company or prefers aloneness, whether he prefers external real people or people who exist inside of him, imaginary and so on. So, ये बात भी मजे की है जो मैं कह रहा हूँ. अच्छा, तो so that is one level of understanding that this is, and then if we want to give it a label, we'll call it man has a schizoid tendency, autistic tendency or some such. ठीक है, कोई बुरी बात नहीं है, बिल्कुल सही है. लेकिन ये बात तो आपने प्रोज में सुनी है. अगर पोइट्री में सुनेंगे तो क्या बोलेगा? पोइट्री में सुनेंगे तो वो कह रहा है कि देखिए डॉक्टर साहब,
उसको कोई समझ नहीं पाया कभी.
करीब हैं आप, you're getting better. You have good prognosis for you. You have good prognosis. That the patient is saying, I will come and see you, but don't expect that I will tell you everything about myself. I'm the sort of person who keeps at least 1/3 of things to myself. इस बात का ख्याल रखिएगा, you will never know me. That's what the patient is saying. ये शायरी में आ गया. So when we listen to a patient, we try to listen as a prose and we try to listen as poetry. This is the most important function. This is the most important overlap between poetry and prose. Abhi, specific use and talking, those two are other things. Right now, just stay with listening. Just stay with listening. Jewish patient, and I deliberately take the name of the religion because it looks like a Hindu thought. It was not a Hindu woman. Jewish woman had a beloved pet. The beloved pet dies. She is extremely upset and goes in very profound grief. Then one day she's sitting and near a window in an apartment, and she sees a small spider in the corner. Dark spider. So obviously I'm thinking dark in the corner. My place in sitting in the room is in the corner. The spider grabbing, controlling her thoughts and such. But I remain quiet. She says that as I saw the spider, it suddenly occurred to me, maybe my bird has become reincarnated. And she has become a spider. and she has come to meet me. Now she's talking as if to herself. I'm sitting right here, she's sitting right here. She says, but there's no such thing as reincarnation. And birds cannot become spiders anyway. No. But maybe she can. Maybe a bird can become a spider. And then she looks at me and she says, you don't think I'm crazy, do you? I said, no, not at all. Not at all. In fact, I think this spider is a poem. I said, I think this spider is a poem. Meaning, let us not, for God's sake, get into whether a spider becomes bird, bird becomes spider. That's not the point. It's not a logical debate, for God's sake. It is that this thought has occurred to you and your mind has created an interesting idea. And let's play with that idea. 6 saal ka bachcha, 6-year-old child says to you, Mom, I'm Superman. Is he Superman? Yes. Is he not Superman? Yes. Both things are true. Both things are true. So can the birds become spiders? Yes. Can the bird become a spider? No. It's irrelevant. That matter is irrelevant. What is relevant is that this thought exists. And this thought has meaning. And this thought has been needed. And this thought is a creation of a mystery. That mystery is, how the hell can I let go of something that I so much love? And that's the pain she's struggling with. And you have to join at that moment in that play, in that poem. If poet is reciting something, then you cannot question him in reality. We have to play along with the poet. Same thing, we have to play along with the patient. And only then the thing will open, bit by bit, and new meanings will emerge, and new depth will emerge. That is the biggest thing. Listening to the material as if it is prose, but also listening to the material as if it's poetry. And then you come up with two different meanings which overlap but are distinct. And then you have to choose which one to pay attention, what time, for what purpose, and so on and so forth. That is the work we are doing when we're doing it deep and intensive psychotherapy. Listening. Now here is another poem. This is a poem from Emily Dickinson, who, in my opinion, one of the finest poets United States has produced. Three lines only, a small poem. There's a dash. Pain, dash, so utter. Pain, so utter, it swallows the substance up and then covers the abyss with trance. Now think about this poem. It's an unbelievable poem. Pain, so utter, it swallows the substance up and then covers the abyss with trance. What pain? What is pain? What is pain? Not in the body. We are not interested in the body. We are psychiatrists. There's something called mental pain. Mental pain. You know what mental pain is? ठीक है. No, you have to go back again. More deeper. No. More. I'm going to teach you.
Loss and
Huh?
grief, loss.
You're close, but you're not right. Those are two different things. Being close and being correct are not the same things. I'm going to teach this to you. In 1926, in an addendum to inhibition symptoms and anxiety, Freud says there are three kinds of reactions to separation from loved ones. If we don't need them, but we want them, we enjoy them, we like them, then they go away, then it causes sadness, grief, mourning. If we need them, and without them we cannot function properly, and then they go away, it causes separation anxiety. But if we do not even feel in a major part of our mind that they are separate human beings, mostly we feel that they are ours. They are like my hand, nose, ears. Then when they go away, he's writing and it stops. And there's a dash, that means he cannot find a word. Or that he got into pain by thinking of this. And then he says, it causes Seelenschmerz, Seelenschmerz, pain of the mind. The pain of the soul is when somebody we take for granted as ours separates from us and tells us, for example, suppose door opens and my son enters or my daughter enters. I say, beta, yahan kya kar rahe ho? What are you doing here? And suppose my son, who are you? I said, are you crazy? I'm your father. They say, I don't recognize you. I don't know who you are. Sadness, though, it'll come. It's like somebody cut pain. So the pain is so severe, so utter. What is the word utter? अच्छा severe, ठीक है? हाँ? नंबर तो मिल चुके हैं आप लोग सब. बाबा शायरी से सोचो ना यार, शायरों की तरफ. Think mad, then you'll get it. देखो utter तो एक है to speak. दूसरा utter का क्या मतलब है? एक है severe, दूसरा का है speak. He uttered such and such thing, right? ये खेल है शायर का. ऐसे आसान में एक लफ्ज को आसान में फ्री में बेचते तो हो चुका शायर. So utter, meaning how severely painful, or because I got blocked after writing the word pain, so now tell me. ये खेल है, आसान नहीं है चीज. Pain so utter. It swallows the substance up. Now this is very interesting. Swallowing was always down. This is very intriguing. But English is a mother tongue. He's a serious writer. Usually when we swallow, things go down. Swallows the substance up. That's very interesting. Why? Then covers the abyss. That means a gap has happened. Abyss. A gap has happened. With trance. What does trance mean? A kind of hypnoid, mesmerized state, an auto-hypnosis, right? This is a very interesting little poem, pretty much about writing poetry. Pretty much about writing poetry. Just up. It swallows the substance up is that something that is getting lost is pulled upward into mentalization. So a somatic existential loss is turned into language. And that's why the word utter is used in two different ways. See, these remarkable things about poetry. What is poetry and why it helps? एक मिनट, हमसे भी कुछ बातें कर माफ कर दिया. अच्छा, poetry, what is the components of poetry? Poetry links the unconscious with the conscious. The pre-verbal, all of us carry a pre-verbal part, non-verbal part. For 1.5 years, we lived in this world without speaking. Those experiences do not exist inside of us, and the impact of those experiences does not exist. If that's the case, a dog or a cat or a bird that are your pets, they are feeling, they are thinking, Same way baby is thinking, the baby may not have words, but the baby exists in inside of all of us. Non-verbal and verbal, right brain and left brain, conscious and unconscious, and masculine and feminine, and mother and father, and music and prose. That's in between is poetry. Music is related to mother's body because of placental pulsations, because of the heartbeat of the mother when the baby is taken to the left breast, because of lullabies. Prose is associated with father's injunctions and prohibitions. So that poetry resides midway between music and prose, conscious and unconscious, pre-verbal and non-verbal and verbal, and such. It requires some logic. It becomes crazy. And therefore, a good poem should be slightly logical and slightly illogical, leaving a space. वो मैं कदे को जगाने वाला, वो रात की नींद उड़ाने वाला. वो मैं कदे को जगाने वाला, वो रात की नींद उड़ाने वाला, न जाने क्या उसके जी में आई कि शाम होते ही घर गया. Now this creates a scene and leaves you thinking, न जाने क्या उसके जी में आई. Look at another space. एक वो मिलना, एक ये मिलना, एक वो मिलना, एक ये मिलना. क्या तू मुझको छोड़ रहा है? छोड़ रहा है, ये नहीं छोड़ चुका है, छोड़ दिया है. And even that observation is dubious. Watching a movement and being not sure about it. And that is where poetry is, where conscious, unconscious, pre-verbal, verbal, and right brain, left brain, feminine, masculine, maternal, paternal, things will come, music and prose and come in. And at that time, if you notice all the structures of poetry, meta-constituents, which is rhyme, meter, alliteration, simile, metaphor, refrain, all of them have one characteristic. They show duality and they show separation. For example, rhyme. दिल नादा तुझे हुआ क्या है? आखिर इस दर्द की दवा क्या है? हुआ और दवा. They are telling you one thing is same. आ. लेकिन who and the are different. हुआ क्या है? दवा क्या है? Something is same, something is different. So in every structure of the meta-constituent, there is a subtle oscillation of recognition of a duality and also recognition of separateness, which is the fundamental problem all human beings have. And that is that we have become separated from our mothers. When we were 4 months old, 1 month old, 2 months old, most likely we thought me and my mommy are one. And then, God damn it, we figure out that she's a separate person with her own ideas and her own will and her own intentions. And she is not our servant. She is not our hand or nose or ear. She is a separate human being. And for the rest of our life, we keep looking for somebody to become one with, who will understand us 100% and do exactly what we want and whenever we want and in whichever way we want. And we never find such a human being. One day, God takes mercy on us and kills us. Because God is also kind. So he says, this struggle is too long, gone on for this search. But we are all looking for that. One person to treat us utterly, especially, understand us completely, agree with us completely, and adore us and love us when we want to be loved, and not love us when we don't want to be loved, in the way we want to be loved, when we want to be loved, in the amount. That's mother of a 2-month-old child. All of us are looking for that. Poetry, by its meta-constituents that emphasize separateness and duality, cause the healing of this wound. Now, last comment. About the specific use, when I'm talking about the thinking, listening use of poetry and to the psychotherapeutic dialogue. Second is the specific use of poems. So I was treating a patient whose mother had died when she was 4 years old. The patient was 57. And you know that the death of a mother at that time will have lifelong injury. There are two kinds of griefs. that are not ever curable fully. One is the death of mother between 2 and 8, and second is the death of an adult child. People who lose a 21-year-old, 25-year-old, 30-year-old, they never recover. It's unresolvable grief. This patient will become better, then worse, better, then worse, and better, than worse. And for a long period, it looked like that she had mourned as much as she could, and she is now quite peaceful, and she is aware of the various and diverse effects of the childhood maternal loss on her, and she can regulate her life. Just like knowing that you have severe diabetes, you can live a reasonable life. Same way with childhood maternal loss. One time, something happened, and bam, she regressed and became so sad and crying bitterly in the session. So I remained quiet, and this is for you, Akhtar, that when a patient's affect is going up, emotion rising, don't speak. No point. Patient's mind is getting, cognition is getting compromised. Is not going to understand. And just wait, every affect comes down by itself. Like this. The place to speak is post-peak. Here, as it's coming down, this is the place to speak. So I said, when she just began to settle, I said, and this was an American patient who does not understand Urdu. So I said, there's 2 lines in a poem in my mother tongue. I'll recite them to you and I'll translate. Kitne tufan uthaye aankhon ne. Kitne tufan uthaye aankhon ne, now yaadon ki dubti hi nahi. How many storms have my eyes borne, but this goddamn boat of memory never sinks. And the patient could understand. So this is the kind of thing. Now there are pros and cons of my having this spoken in my mother tongue to a patient who doesn't understand. Why not? What's the advantage? What's the disadvantage? And so on and so forth. Just finer details. But here is a direct use of a poem within the therapeutic session. So we can sometimes directly use, and we cannot use it with every patient. The patient has to be of that kind and in that mode, etc., etc. Direct use of poetry, listening to material, all material as poetry. 2. And 3, the speaking like a poet. One patient who was a Jewish man, rich man, but he was extremely embarrassed about being Jewish and pretended to be Christian in many, many, many ways. As he and I worked, his shame went down. One day he found out I'm Muslim. And he became very ashamed of that. So one day I said to him, he said then a day came, he was going to give a talk at a very important place. And he came, he was in the session, and he says, by the way, I want to let you know that I'm no longer ashamed of being a Jew. So I said, you sound like Richard Nixon to me. The famous sentence, I'm not a crook. So he laughed and he said, you're a smart guy. He says, are you suggesting that I still am? I said, yes. I think you still have some shame about being a Jew, and you still have some shame about my being a Muslim. And for the work you and I have undertaken, our responsibility is to figure out, what do these two shames have to do with each other? Pause, and then 3 words came out of my mouth. Are they sisters? Now, are they sisters is not a necessary thing to say. It was a spontaneous musical or poetic movement in me. And I presented this case someplace, and some people ask, why did you use the word sisters? Because you are a man and the patient is a man. Why didn't you say, are they brothers? I was saying, what do these 2 shames have to do with each other? And I was myself shocked later on as to why. And then it occurred to me that both words, sharm or haya, in my mother tongue are feminine words. And therefore, because I was speaking in that 3 words from my poet self, that's why it came out translated as sisters. But we can talk as a poet, we can listen as a poet, and we can use poetry sometimes. I will end on the following story. My aunt once called me, 90-year-old woman, educated, bright, had been to London School of Economics and translated John Maynard Keynes' Principles of Macroeconomics from German into Urdu. she called me and she said, you know, your brother came by and I raised him as a child, and he came like 1 mile and to visit some your brother and complain. तो मैंने कहा अम्मा ऐसा करिए, गालिब का एक शेर है, वो लिख लें आप, दिन में 3 बार पढ़ें और ठंडा पानी पी लें. निकाला चाहता है काम क्या तानों से तू गालिब. What are you going to get out of being sarcastic? What is sarcasm going to produce? निकाला चाहता है काम क्या तानों से तू गालिब, तेरे बेमेहर कहने से वो तुझ पे मेहरबान क्यों हो. You'll say you don't love me. Rajendra, you don't love me, I know. You say, sir, कल से love शुरू कर दूंगा. नहीं, if you accuse somebody, the chances of their loving is even less. तो मैंने कहा मैं ऐसे लिख लें कागज पे, 3 बार पढ़ें और ठंडा पानी पिए. So ये भी होता है. गालिब थेरेपी हो सकती है, पुड़िया बांध के दे दिया गालिब की, और ऐसे हर चीज पॉसिबल है, हर चीज पॉसिबल है. लेकिन there is direct use of poetry, there is listening as a poet, there is speaking as a poet. But of the 3, the most important is listening as a poet, because this puts us in touch with what the deeper message that the patient is trying to convey. Because the patient comes, he knows some things, and he doesn't know something. What he doesn't know is troubling him. And the only way we can get to that, what he does not know, is by remaining peaceful, patient, maintaining faith that working hard, waiting, and having good intention and seeking knowledge will one day produce good result. And then we stay and the flower blossoms. That is what this thing is about. And I'm very grateful that you listened to me. Some of you listened to me, thank you. And that you listened to me reasonably peacefully without thinking that I was totally crazy, which is an achievement of both you and me. And it's nice that you heard. And if you got some education also in it, God bless, and God bless Vanessa for inviting. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Yes.
You can take.
Yes, please.
We have 15 minutes. Whereby if you have some questions to Salman, he will be very glad to.
And if you have answers, I'll be even more glad.
And India, may I request you to kindly raise the temperature here? It is becoming too cold for my count.
I thought this problem only existed between me and my wife. Temperature problem. अच्छा हाँ बोलिए कुछ सवाल जवाब. Ask यार. I'm freely available to you. इसके पैसे लगते हैं आमतौर पे. आपको फ्री में एडवाइस मिल रही है. Ask. Yes, good. I wouldn't call it. See, I'm become very hesitant about labels. I've become very about labels. I've lost faith in many diagnostic labels, and I've also not have much faith in various therapeutic labels. So I wouldn't call it poetry therapy. Please no. You know, the use of poetry or the use of poetic principles in listening, talking, and understanding. Yes, I think it can be very helpful. There's no doubt. Because the way we understand a poem, already our heart has become mellow. See, it's like I ask when people apply for becoming a psychoanalyst or even psychiatrist, when interviewing, had you applied Akhtar, that's what I would have asked you. 3 things. Do you like children? 5-year-old, 4-year-old? Can you spend some time with a child happily? 1. 2, do you like animals? Dog, cat, any other animal. I'm biased to dogs, but cat is fine. Horse. And 3, do you like poetry? What's common in them is in all 3, we are dealing with a non-logical, non-verbal, non-exploitative communication. And if that capacity is there, then one can be a good psychotherapist. And I think that poetry helps us. So I recommend people to read more and more poetry and stretch their mind. And sometimes you will not understand, but then you read about poetry. The best two books I recommend, if you really want to understand, begin to really get poetry. One book is called This Craft of Verse. This Craft of Verse, V-E-R-S-E, by Jorge Luis Borges, Argentinian poet. And the second book is called Letters to a Young Poet by Rainier Maria Rilke.
Yes.
This is not much about psychiatry. You have dealt with multiple languages as how much do you think is lost in translation?
Yes. If you make a list of world's great writers in prose, you will find at least 10 world-class, internationally respected and adored and renowned writers of prose who are writing in a language that is not their mother tongue. The number is at least 10, 15, 20. I can rattle off many names right now. People who are writing great prose in a language that's not their mother tongue. The number of poets who are great, internationally renowned poets who are writing poetry in a language that is not their mother tongue is zero. Because when you translate, that's why if you go to Bahari Sons and buy a book of Ghalib's translation, Faz's translation, most of them are atrocious. Because when you're translating, in poetry, words are not used only for the word literal meaning of the word. They are used for their sound quality. They are used for their kindling ability as to what else can this word remind you of. They're chosen for their connection with the next word or the following lines words. So their words are not used only or solely, sometimes not even for the purpose of their denotative power, but for their connotational power, their prosodic and musical quality, and their kindling abilities. So that when you translate, then most translation is yeah. I mean, for example, this line, "Aaj bazaar mein pa bajona chalo." Let us walk even if our feet are chained on the street. It can never capture the emotion that is there.
Yes.
Yes,
Basic question, basically like listening like a poet, understanding poetry, it is more of a innate, inherent quality like genetic, or a person can acquire it also, because it depends, like many people are more of creative and more under abstract thinking is different.
What about upright locomotion? What do you think about that? Is it genetic? Upright
Acquired.
It is an acquired, and who are raised by wolves. They never walk standing. They walk on all fours because there's nobody there to tell them, show them, or encourage them. Same thing about thinking. We teach our children to think. Same thing about poetry. That we have the capacity. We just have to cultivate it. We either have to find a teacher or we'll be our own teachers. We'll read. That's why I recommended these two books, This Craft of Verse and Letters to a Young Poet. So we can teach ourselves. I mean, my wife is Turkish, and when I go to Turkey, everybody, sometimes I joke with her. I said, "Wow, you speak so fluent Turkish." So, and she can say, "How come so you speak so fluent Urdu?" You see, these are acquired things. Genetically, we were given that we can speak, but what we will speak, same way with thinking, we can teach ourselves to think, more or less, more or less.
Yes, there was a question. ये आप जोर से बोलो तो
Now, suppose one patient is narrating his problem or his stories to three different psychiatrists. By chance, all psychiatrists are poet or sire also. So, do you think they all three will reach on the same conclusion, or they will reach on the different conclusion?
They could reach on different conclusions, of course. I mean, if we ask three Pandit Jasraj, Pandit Bhimsen, and Kishori Amonkar, कि just आप थोड़ा जो है राग यमन का एक piece सुना दें, would they sing exactly the same way? I don't doubt it. Three cricketers, three wicket in a cricket, three bowlers, three batsmen. तो ये दोनों चीज है, एक रूल है और रूल के अंदर अपनी पर्सनालिटी. वो पर्सनालिटी रूल से को तोड़ नहीं सकती है और रूल पर्सनालिटी को ऑब्स्ट्रक्ट नहीं कर सकता. दोनों चीज चाहिए ना. We need both things. So it is a tailored, individualized. Yeah.
तो सर डायग्नोसिस और लाइन ऑफ ट्रीटमेंट चेंज हो जाएगा?
Of course. शादी कर लेते किसी और से तो आपकी जिंदगी बदल जाती या नहीं?
बदल चुकी है
I
सर.
said, had you married somebody else, then your life will be different. नहीं, या वही भी ऐसे ही रहते हैं जैसे एक बीवी आई है दूसरी बीवी आई, जिंदगी तो बदलेगी.
तो मतलब सर ये पॉसिबिलिटी है कि एक साइकियाट्रिस्ट जो पोएट भी है
जी,
उसने सिजोफ्रेनिया बना दिया, दूसरे ने साइकोटिक
मैंने
डिप्रेशन
छोड़
बना
दिए
दिया,
ये सब लफ्ज.
तीसरे ने सिजो
मैं इन लफ्जों से जा चुका हूँ आगे. मुझे फेथ नहीं रही इन सब.
सर
बात जो आप कह रहे हैं वो पहली बात अच्छी थी. क्या समझने में फर्क हो सकता है? हाँ, हो सकता है. और इसमें क्या है कि देखिए, वी आर डीलिंग विद ए डिसिप्लिन व्हिच इज हाफ साइंस हाफ आर्ट. You know, half science, half art. It's both. It's neither this nor that. It's both. And therefore, there is always the need for discipline. You cannot be crazy. There has to be method, and you have to have read and thought, and you have to sort out what is you're imposing on it and what may exist. And sometimes we do mistakes, but certainly a certain amount of personal freedom of interpretation has to remain. Just the way any cricketer plays according to the rules of whatever is called International Cricket Association. But each cricketer is different. And same thing with each psychiatrist, it should be. Otherwise, we will be, I'm sure each surgeon is not safe, you know.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, sir.
हाँ?
सर मुझे ऐसा लगता है कि 5 साइकियाट्रिस्ट का एक जैसे होने की probability may be a little bit higher compared to 5 psychoanalysts. And the reason why I say that is that the room for interpretation is so different. And if we look at the non-biological aspect of our understanding, what I'm going to bring back to reflecting to the patient will never bring back another you. And so my life may just end up being a learning experience, and I may not just get closer. So like you very beautifully said, we're dealing with a discipline which is half science and half art.
Yes.
And the other day we were in a meeting where somebody was very strongly rebuking that I think all of us are responsible also for demedicalization of our specialty, because we want to talk like therapists, and we want to hype up the fad of therapy that people
Why
are.
is that
are
demedicalization?
no.
But why is that demedicalization?
Sure.
You
It's
mean
not.
medicine
It's
should
not
not do
essentially
psychotherapy?
something I endorse. But what I'm saying is that eventually we might, as scientists in us, we might the reductionistic model of trying to see everything in terms of neurochemical and science and easy solutions where you prescribe a pill and the patient gets well, and we are far to anywhere close to reaching that utopian goal. So I mean, if we put that together, is it worthwhile for us to evoke the shayer or the poet in us? Will maybe end us being helping us being more empathetic and reaching out to and connecting to our patients better. But what are we really, what is the utopian goal, sir? I mean, are we contending to provide a platform where we are deemed as better human beings and better clinicians? thus helping us to also use the science and the pharmacological understanding of our science. Any thoughts? I mean,
no, this I see human beings are biopsychosocial animals, and all maladies and all remedies and all etiologies are biological, psychological, and social. So now we have our own career choices. We have our own career choices, right? So, I mean, we went to medical school. We did not become an ophthalmologist. That does not mean we do not. अब वो सुन ही नहीं रहे, तो ये भी एक इलाज है. सवाल पूछने के बाद सुनना भी चाहिए सरकार.
Sorry, sir.
मतलब कि आपने कहा कि एक डोसा लेके आओ, मैं तो इतना लंबा डोसा लेके आ रहा हूँ, आप कहते हैं मैं खाऊंगा ही नहीं, ये तो गलत बात है. खैर, तो अब इसमें ये है कि see, when we went to medical school, we decided not to become an ophthalmologist. You know, that does not mean we have no respect for the eye and no respect for ocular problem. And if a person has some eye disease, we will certainly refer them to an ophthalmologist and not try to treat it ourselves. Same thing, I think, within psychiatry is a very big field with all sorts of subspecialties. And we will somehow willy-nilly either make a choice to practice a certain kind of psychiatry, or we will practice everything that then we will not be an expert in anything. Because after all, how much a human being can learn. I right now have only 11 patients in treatment. Out of those 11 patients, 2 patients are also on medication. I never prescribe those medications. Why? Because I don't read about medications. I don't think I've read a single paper or a book pertaining to psychopharmacology for 15, 20, 25 years. So I'm no longer consider myself an expert in that, and I want my patient to get best care. So I send them to, there are 3 people in town that I respect, that they know about medications. So I send them and I tell them, you do whatever they tell you. Whatever they tell you to take, see them, meet them once in 3 months, check it over. If you run out of medication and they're out of town, I'll certainly call and get you some. But I don't deal with medication because I'm not knowledgeable anymore about this subject. But that does not mean I do not respect. Of course, if somebody is psychotic, hallucinating, they should get medications. You know? But my clientele is predominantly what used to be called neurotic patients. Now, I think in current terminology, anxiety disorder patients or personality disorder patients, mostly non-psychotic, relatively well-functioning, but internally deeply troubled people. And for them, this kind of work is good.
I think we won't take any more questions from the floor. But Nimesh is also one of the chair, so he also has a ask or make a
Thanks.
Yes.
So, Dr. Akhtar, if I might first ask for an interpretation to be bounced off you, and then I want to come to a point linked to that. In the initial part of your usually humor-filled introductions, when you spoke about don't take me seriously and this is serious business, I saw that as a classical double bind. Would that be correct or agreeable?
You've gone.
No, if it is, and you also referred to in the duration of your talk about implicitly, I think, how conflict or dualism is inevitable. And the thought that occurs to me today, and has occurred to me often enough in the past, is that in therapy or in life in general, double bind is unavoidable because dualism and conflicts are inevitable. And poetry actually brings it out pretty well. Prose does too, but poetry has that advantage of bringing out both the basic underlying dualism and the conflict of human existence, as well as the double bind, often enough.
Yeah, see, my comment about seriousness was that I have found more so in India than in other countries, that people listen to things very seriously. And those who listen, there are people who are not listening, that's okay, that happens everywhere. But the people who listen, they listen with too much seriousness and also with a kind of modicum of reverence. Both things are useful and harmful at the same time. some respect is essential. Otherwise, why would you listen to this person? You know, you would think you already know, and you will not have any scope to be taught something new. Conversely, if you become too reverential, then you are not making the knowledge yours. You're just swallowing it. Lock, stock, and barrel. You're not digesting it properly by questioning it and by seeing whether it fits or not fits and such. So that was my thing. Also, I speak somewhat irreverentially, so I want people to join me in, so that I don't appear too much like a clown or something. I want people to be a little relaxed also. Come to the circus. You don't go to.
Confirming what I asked.
Yes, yes, of course, of course.
Thank you. Thank you, Salman. Thank you very much for dealing with a difficult topic. That's very. So we move to next talk of this afternoon. That is by Dr. A.K. Kala, Anirudh, and he is talking to us about the trauma and the psychology.
Yes, I can see you better. यहाँ बैठूंगा पीठ दिखाई देगी कोई नहीं ना आपको से
कहाँ से बोलेंगे आप वही से यार that is not person के उसमें नहीं रेमिट में
This is right.
It's okay. I think it's very unfair to put a prose writer after a poet, because I seriously believe that poetry has a sweet surreptitiousness about it. And while prose is knocking at the doors of the consciousness, poetry eases itself through the cracks in the door and makes itself comfortable. So that is the unfair advantage that I'm talking about. I don't know if all of you know that both of us, Salman and I, worked together in PGI for 4 years as residents. He was a year ahead of me. Now, talking of PGI, all of you also have heard of Professor Vick. Most of you, I think, would have. And a little anecdote. The day our batch got selected for the post-graduation in psychiatry, it was mid-December. I remember it was a cold, rainy Chandigarh day, which Chandigarh specializes in December. And when we came to know, the four of us, that we have been selected, we as very dutiful pupils went to Professor Vick's office to ask him, now that we are going to join psychiatry after a few weeks, we have come to ask you which books should we read, buy and start reading. And he looked at us a little strangely and he said, don't read psychiatry. For the first 6 months, read, you must, but do not read psychiatry. We were a little perplexed. And then he thinks, and after sometimes says, literature padho. Now, we were, too young at that time to see the connection. But what he also meant was that for psychiatry is so important that it should not be left only to psychiatry books. What he was saying was that the related disciplines, all of them, whether it is sociology, whether it is education, whether it is literature, whether it is poetry, all impinge upon psychiatry to a greater or a larger extent. Now, I'll be talking about the overlap between literature, trauma, and psychopathology in general in my usual meandering manner. But to make it less meandering, there'll be some emphasis on partition trauma. Since historically that one upheaval 75 years back altered the subcontinent forever, overturned the lives of millions of its people, and produced a very rich body of literature. The nitty-gritty of partition was planned at Faridkot House on Copernicus Mark here in Delhi, where Mountbatten had his office cum residence. Soon after partition, when communal bloodbath erupted in Delhi, many Muslim families from the city took shelter at Purana Killa, Humayun's tomb, and Nizamuddin Dargah before leaving for Pakistan. Later, these sites served as refugee camps for Hindus coming from across the border, and they continued to stay at these monuments years after the partition. All the 4 places I have named are at a walkable distance from where they sit. What was the magnitude of partition trauma? At least 1 million people died a violent death and 10 million people uprooted, making it the largest forced migration in the history of mankind. All of this just in a few months. At least 60,000 young women were kidnapped, raped, and converted on both sides. And just when they had settled down in their new exiled lives, and some even had children, were picked up by police and forcibly sent across the border to their former families who had deserted them in the first place. Thank you. Because now the 2 countries had hastily reached a pact. Muslim women from Indian Punjab were sent to Pakistan, and the Hindu and Sikh women from the newly formed Pakistan to India. Many against their wishes in the name of Izzat of the countries. The most memorable writings about partition trauma were written by people who were themselves caught in the tornado and traumatized. We are talking here of Krishi Chandra, Rajinder Singh Bedi, Saadat Hassan Manto, Amrita Preeta, Ismat Chugtai, Bhisham Sahni, Mohan Rakesh, Khushwant Singh, and many others. About Manto's trauma or psychopathology, we know that he had alcoholism and he didn't make any secret of it. We also know that he was admitted in mental hospital in Lahore. It is said that he was admitted for alcoholism only, but then we do not know. Very few people admitted to mental hospitals just for it. We also know that Manto was in Bombay from 36 to 48, 12 years, and he was doing rather well. He was accepted part of the budding film world at that time, but he suddenly decided to leave. His friends say that he was very upset, very disturbed, and a bit paranoid, according to, that was the judgment of people. That being a Muslim, he will be victimized, he will not get work, or he may even be killed. And from there, if some of you have watched Nandita Das's Mancho, a friend asked him at that time, you are talking of going to Pakistan. There is no need, this is Bombay. और तुम तो इतने कोई मुस्लिम भी नहीं हो. And that's when he says कि इतना मुस्लिम तो हूँ कि मारा जा सकूं. So that thing, it wasn't that he was, not a very, person who wasn't concerned about his personal safety. There was a tinge of paranoia, it seems. If we look at writings from those times, these were characterized by intensity and poignancy, provided by the proximity of the events and the immediacy of the events. Those things were happening right then in front of your eyes. Now, Manto wrote a story. It is a very well-known story, Thanda Gosht. The story is set in the days of the free-for-all violence that occurred in Punjab during the summer of 47. The protagonist of the story is Ishwar Singh. After having been away for many days to loot and kill people, this was this side of Punjab, he meets his mistress Kulwant after many days, who has been missing, who has been wondering where he has gone. And when Ishwar Singh comes back, he looks visibly shaken, and upset as he was, he's not able to perform sex with her. She suspects him of infidelity, and in a fit of jealousy, stabs him with his own dagger. While dying, Ishwar Singh admits that he had killed a Muslim family and had abducted a girl after breaking into their house. Later, when attempting to rape her, he discovers that he had kidnapped a dead body. It's a story that stuns you and then shakes you off. Another famous / notorious story from those days by Manto was Kholzo. sides, the kadas and beads and things, and throws away the religious symbols she had collected from both the sides. She comes out and instead of boarding her husband's bus, gets into a government bus going to a refugee camp in Delhi. The young conductor with a clipboard asks her name. She replies Harpreet. The conductor asks, "Sirf Harpreet, agge piche kuch nahi." She smiles and says, "Agge piche kuch nahi." For her piety, as she was, the coping for what she had gone through was to hell with you all. Now, a bit of personal professional account is in order here. My parents came from Lahore during partition, who were conceived in Pakistan, but born in independent India. This in India and Pakistan as embryos. I grew up with the children of other refugees on this side of the border. We heard that word a lot. Most of the times in school, but it was most of the times a descriptive label. I mean, we were refugees, not a disparaging one. Sometimes it was. Children whose parents had shifted from Multan and Jhang areas were bullied more because they spoke Punjabi differently. During the first years, homes changed frequently because families took time to settle down. At home, from our parents, all one heard was how everything was so good back in Lahore. There was never any mention of wars. Other than the retrospective glamorization, there was complete silence. They did not talk about the killings or the other horrors, even among themselves, or to other relatives, or to friends who too were refugees. Houses were small, we would have heard if they had talked. In retrospect, that silence was stunning. And it led to a rupture in the chain of family histories and a yawning gap in the attachment and belongingness that family histories provide. Bare bones, like names of the ancestors and what they did, that we came to know. That was not a secret. But the emotional components were missing, because those are handed down by word of mouth as part of intimate family tales. That memory side is another aspect of partition, which is less talked about, but equally traumatic and in the long run, harmful. All that we heard was that everything was so great back in Lahore. Every third or fourth family, because we children exchange notes, would say कि वहाँ इतना अच्छा सब कुछ था. In one of those 3 or 4 families, हमारे घर के आगे हाथी झूलता था. Now that of course means opulence. None of us was rich. We were all middle class. So that our families, our parents, the whole society was not just repressing, they were also doing reaction formation. Reaction formation, I'm sure most of you know, if you want to hide a thing, you bury it. If you want to hide it even more so that it's not discovered, you bury it, and on top of that, you erect something which is exactly opposite to that what you have buried. So that was the elephant, in the story. Even as children, we sensed everything is never so idyllic, particularly when conversations reached us about relatives who had faced ujada, which in Punjabi means devastation, during the Raleigh, which means riots. And conversations reached us about that distant uncle who could not make it because he was stabbed. He had gone out to fetch milk. When he asked my mother about it, and children asked repeatedly, the stock reply was, nothing happened in our mohalla. It happened in the next month. When at school we exchanged notes, all mothers were saying the same thing. Nothing happened in our village, it happened in the next village. As if thousands of mothers had collaborated en masse. At that time, we just felt shortchanged for information. When we grew up, we knew we were being protected by mothers from being told about the mayhem that the partition of India was, and about our own families and friends and relatives having been slaughtered. When we grew up a little more, we came to know that we were being protected by our parents also from the uncomfortable fact that some of our relatives too had actively participated in violence. Both on that side, but even more so after coming back to this side. We were being protected from the fact that the difference between the perpetrators and the victims was not that stark in 47. And our parents, through their silence, were not just protecting us, but also protecting themselves from the pain of reliving that unsettling trauma. And then there was that very uncomfortable fact to deal with, that of people having cajoled and coaxed their own young daughters to jump into wells and die so that they would not be defiled. Do you realize that 75 years later, even now, we talk so little of it? We don't. It is a taboo. It was this massive denial and repression which stopped us from having a partition museum till just 5 years back. And even now, it is an apology of a museum, not just too late, but too little also. In one significant manner, Holocaust was very different from partition. Holocaust was one-sided, partition was not. 1 million people were killed here. The British didn't kill them. We did, on both sides. In Holocaust, one side was the perpetrator, the other side the victim. It was simpler. Trauma could be ascribed to one side and guilt to the other. As the host tried to calm the girl, her mother, who had been parking the car, came in, profusely embarrassed and full of apologies. She explained that the girl is being treated for a mental illness and has been missing her medication. Obviously, the young woman, a first-year university student, as we came to know, had heard such narratives from some friend who had heard it from somewhere else. And I remember my own patient who had been uprooted along with her family from Multan. This is what intergenerational trauma and mirror imaging of symptoms would look like when both populations were the attackers as well as the attacked. There were not many patients in the clinic at the time, as there were no clinics. All psychiatry happened in a mental hospital. Indian Punjab did not even have a mental. It came up later. Secondly, there was no awareness that these were psychiatric disorders, because after what happens after very severe cataclysmic trauma, that even severe and florid mental dysfunction is considered understandable. इतनी बड़ी बात हुई है तो इतना तो होना ही. And even if there had been awareness, the number of psychiatrists in the whole country at that time could be counted on the fingers of two hands. The concept of trauma leading to psychological disorders was put together in a systemic form by Sigmund Freud. To me, all psychoanalysis is the study of emotional trauma. However, the medicalization of trauma in the form of PTSD, which is different from the psychoanalytic concept of trauma, happened for the first time in 1980 in DSM-3. Although it crystallized as a proper concept much later in the 90s after the Yugoslavian wars. The terms which had been used earlier were the shell shock, the first war, the traumatic neurosis, second war. From the historical perspective, the significant change brought by PTSD concept was the stipulation that the cause was clearly outside the individual as opposed to an inherent individual weakness or illness or instinct. The key to understanding PTSD is the fact that trauma has lifelong and even intergenerational as well as transgenerational consequences. We use the word transgenerational when the trauma is collective, when intergenerational, usually when the trauma is individual, but passed from one generation to the next. The concept of PTSD also underlines the fact that when trauma is severe, terrifying, and way outside ordinary human experience, then the commonly used pop psychology advice, what does not kill you, improves you, does not apply. Here, the trauma does not kill you, does not improve you, and leaves you much worse. The risk of exposure to trauma has been part of our human existence. Attacks by wild animals probably produce similar psychological sequelae in the survivors of such wars. Shakespeare's plays, as has been indicated earlier, are full of battles and trauma. And one of the compelling speeches about the life of a soldier comes from a woman, actually. Lady Percy in Henry IV speaks to her husband Hotspur, who has come from the battle but is going back the next morning, like this. Tell me, sweet Lord, what is that takes from thee thy stomach pleasure and thy golden sleep? Why dost thou bend thine eyes upon the earth and start so often when thou sits alone? Why hast thou lost the fresh blood in thy cheeks and given my treasure and my rights of thee to thick-eyed musing and cursed melancholy? In thy fate slumbers, I by thee have watched and heard the murmurs tales of iron walls, speak terms of manage to thy bondings. And it goes on. A better description in literature of flashbacks and autonomic symptoms of PTSD is hard to find. Shakespeare's Henry IV appears to meet many of the diagnostic criteria of PTSD. This also tells us that writers with their intuitive understanding of human nature wrote about PTSD centuries before psychiatrists discovered it. Another example from Shakespeare is that of Lady Macbeth, which you mentioned. This is a study of a woman who early in the play starts showing grandiose ideas, including conviction that Macbeth should be the king and she the rightful queen. There is classic thought disorder and flight of ideas present in her monologue. Later, there are hallucinations and delusions when she cannot get rid of the smell and stains of blood on her hands. Later still, ignored by her husband, she becomes deeply depressed and suicidal, and finally jumps off the castle and kills herself. Lady Macbeth was seen at that time as a force of ambition and evil who deserved her fate, which reflects the age in which it was written and the religious wars of those times. A more non-judgmental interpretation now might be of an unstable psychotic woman driven to suicide by depression. In Virginia Woolf's 1928 novel, Mrs. Dalloway, Septimus is a shell-shocked soldier in World War I. He is a unique figure in literature because he was one of the first characters in modern English literature to show the horrors of war and subsequent trauma. Woolf does not depict him as a hero, but rather as a sufferer and survivor, another casualty of war. Septimus thinks that everyone is looking at him, that an aeroplane is signaling to him. He sees flames and faces on cars, and he hears voices calling him horrible names. His transformation by the war was enormous. He began as a boy who loved Shakespeare and poetry, eager to prove himself a man through combat. He comes out deeply cynical of war and purposes. He can never go back to the life he had before or to the faith he had in the English Empire. Virginia Woolf writes of an altered mental state with clarity and tenderness. She, and later Sylvia Plath, both battled with recurrent bouts of depression, and in the end, both committed suicide. Their personal insight and empathy gave intensity and poignancy to their writings. That raises a question. Does it help to be a bit psychotic to be a great writer, a poet, a painter? Is personal hurt necessary? One is tempted to say flippantly, it's not necessary, but it helps. But is there any evidence? Are persons with bipolar disorder and other psychiatric disorders overrepresented among the writers and the artists? Kay Redfield Jamison, herself a clinical psychologist, having bipolar disorder, found that a rate of bipolar disorder was 30 times greater in poets than is present in general population. Good luck with that, Salman. And then there is a very important observation that lithium, when used to treat bipolar disorder in writers and artists, flattens the mood swings, of course, but it also blunts creativity in artists and writers, robbing their subsequent work of sharpness, intensity, and colorfulness. If that is true, I'm asking provocatively, if that is true, is there a case for deliberately undertreating mania in writers and painters if there is an advance directive or an informed consent, and if there are no immediate risks? I have a confession to make. Not in the case of poets or writers or painters. I have deliberately undertreated mania for very mundane considerations. I had a couple. Both of them were patients of bipolar disorder. Sometimes one was depressed, the other was excited. At other times, it was the reverse. And there were the times when both were excited, when one of them needed admission. No other way. And then there were times when grocers didn't get what? Children didn't get sent to school. So we made a pact, the family, that if one of them is manic at the time, let him be hypomanic or manic enough to buy the groceries, do the cooking, and send the children to school. However, even if we consider established that a bipolar illness or a cyclothymic constitution is seen more in writers and artists, that does not necessarily mean that bipolar disorder is what leads to great art or literature. Association is not necessarily causation. Maybe both are a result of another third common factor. Much like Wolf's Septimus was the endearing and perplexing character Eucerian in Catch-22, an iconic novel by Joseph Heller, published in 1961. What Septimus was a soldier in World War I, Eucerian is an American bomber pilot posted in Europe in World War II. In the novel, Snowden, a member of Eucerian's crew, gets hurt when their aircraft is hit by anti-aircraft. Eucerian attempts to treat his visible injuries, but misses a terrible wound hidden by the clothing. That Eucerian was given a medal for this adds to his guilt, and he was never the same person again. The result is several seemingly irrational yet completely sensible acts and utterances by Eucerian during the course of the movie. For example, Eucerian told Clevenger calmly, "They are trying to kill me." "No one is trying to kill you," Clevenger cried. "Then why are they shooting at me?" Eucerian asked. "They are shooting at everyone," Clevenger answered. "They are trying to kill everyone. And what difference does it make?" And another one, just because you are paranoid does not mean they are not after you. Eucerian is talking to somebody. What is a country? This was the Second World War. What is a country? A country is a piece of land surrounded by boundaries, usually unnatural. Englishmen are dying for England. Americans are dying for America. Germans are dying for Germany. Russians are dying for Russia. There are now 50 or 60 countries fighting in this war. Surely, so many countries can't all be worth dying for. While talking of trauma, there's a Hindi saying, "Sona aanch mein tapkar kundan banta," implying a baptism by fire of sauce. And I believe, whatever the nature and degree of stress, it will do you good, and you would come up better. Shrilal Shukla, in his epic novel Rag Darbari, debunks it. While describing a character, a poor rickshaw खींचकर सड़कों पर लंबे लंबे डग भरने के लिए छोड़ देता. Similarly, sometimes we are asked by well-meaning, sensible people to look at the positives of partition. I have looked. But believe me, there were those well-meaning exhortations is some people and some families to have done exceedingly well despite having been refugees from Pakistan. But the fact remains that hundreds of thousands of traumatized people stayed below the radar, and there is no record of how they lived, suffered, and died. There is absolutely no reason to believe that hundreds of thousands of those people did not suffer from PTSD, or what we know today as PTSD. Recently, there has been I'll just skip a few pages. Recently, there has been an effort by researchers to analyze characters depicted in partition literature. Characters of Bhisham Sani, much like those of Manto and Chuktai, behave in a chaotic way due to the fear and trauma in the air during the time of partition. You remember the character Nathu, Thomas, the book and the movie. Nathu is a Dalit, a poor Dalit person who makes his living by removing the hiding of dead animals. And somebody approaches him at the height of criminal tension and asks him to kill a pig and give it to them, because he was told that it's going to be used for veterinarian purposes by a veterinary doctor. So he kills the pig, but the next day what he finds is that the dead pig has been thrown on the steps of the mosque, and a riot has broken, full-fledged communal riot has broken out, and so many people have died. Now, Nathu's guilt consciousness in Tamas is prolonged, whereas the traumatic disorders of protagonists in Bhisham Sani's other stories are quite short-lived. There was a very important book, The Psychological Impact of Partition of India, edited by Alok and Sanjeev Jain, which came out in 2018. I would like to end with a contemporary Hindi book, Maine Mandu Nahi Dekha. I don't know how many of you have read it, but if you haven't, it is a recommendation. This is by Swadesh Deepak, well-known novelist, playwright, and he was a very established writer and a playwright when he fell ill. It is a story of 7 years long mental illness that the author went through, hence a very personal and intimate account. The narrative is intense, disturbing, and even triggering. It starts with the author meeting an attractive woman in Calcutta where he had gone for an intellectual gathering. He starts having a delusional belief that she had seduced him there to Calcutta, and after that followed him the rest of his life. During the course of his illness, he tried to kill himself once by setting a fire in his house and got severely burned. He was admitted in PGI for several months, and he has mentioned it, acknowledged it, named the psychiatrist. And what he writes is that एक रमणीय स्त्री का सारा इतिहास प्रेम का इतिहास होता है, तब मैं नहीं जानता था। एक औरत बहुत सुंदर हो तो उसे प्रणय याचना करनी चाहिए, तब मैं नहीं जानता था। जाओ क्योंकि वो तुम्हें पुकार रही है, तब मैं नहीं जानता था। इसीलिए 7 वर्ष एकाकी कारावास बधा है भाग्य में, तब मैं नहीं जानता था कि एक अत्यंत सुंदर दिल से हमेशा बांकी होती है। मैं नहीं जानता था। मैं नहीं जानता था ये 3 बार मेरे आसपास एक दायरा बनाएगी और मैं पागल हो जाऊंगा। जब वह अपनी राख से जीवित बाहर आएगी तो उसकी केश राशि लाल होगी, तब मैं नहीं जानता था। बन जाऊंगा मैं सम्राट धज्जियों का, तब मैं नहीं जानता था। विपरीत होगी मेरी दशा हैमलेट से, क्योंकि मेरी मैडनेस में कोई मेथड नहीं होगा। So Swadesh Deepak left his house for a walk one morning in 2006 and has not been seen since then. Now, lastly, on a completely different note, a word of caution. We as psychiatrists are periodically accused of pathologizing and psychiatrizing normalcy. So, just because Ghalib wrote to something as passive as Kaide Hayat Bandugam Asmadon, मौत से पहले आदमी गम से निजात पाए क्यों, और मौत का एक दिन मुअय्यन है, नींद क्यों रात भर नहीं आती, पहले आती थी हर बात पर हंसी, पहले आती थी हाल दिल पर हंसी, अब किसी बात पर नहीं आती. He wrote this passive couplets at one time. At another time, he wrote, हैं और भी दुनिया में सुखनवर बहुत अच्छे, कहते हैं कि गालिब का है अंदाज़े बयां और एंड बाजीचा अतफाल है दुनिया मेरे आगे, होता है शब रोज़ तमाशा मेरे आगे, होता है नेहा गर्द में सहरा मेरे होते, खिसता है ज़बी खाक पर दरिया मेरे आगे. This does not necessarily mean that Ghalib had bipolar. So let's not go overboard. There is a huge, human experience between state normalcy and bipolar disorder, which we can call as normal moodiness. So that, and that's an uncharted area, and I hope it doesn't really take us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kala. I'm not sure how many of you have read his book, 2.5 Rivers, but I would recommend that you kindly read, and it tells you the context that how we physical term, and where he describes it very beautifully. When the doctor, who is the protagonist of this novel, he himself becomes depressed and goes to his psychiatrist, and then explains few instances that what is panic, whether I should call this particular phenomena as panic, or when a person should be labeled as paranoid, and when there are police catching up or arresting people for no rhyme or reason. So these are very beautifully described in this book, and yes, I'm sure that you would have referred to that. But otherwise, you have dealt with a long subject and a very, for many, it's a very painful subject of dealing with the trauma of the partition and going through that subtext. May I have some questions? We have 10 minutes at least. So, क्या सर आप शुरू करें?
नहीं, 1-2 questions.
1-2 questions.
I have to just one. Go.
No question. It has ignited
Yes.
some emotions about the partition, which the story which my father told me so many times that it has become a like a imagery, obsessive imagery. My father walking miles from Pakistan, Bahawalpur to Ganganagar, and there was a station where our goods were being transported from Pakistan to Himdumal Court, where on the station he auctions the clothes that were for sale and gets some money with which he made the beginning of his financial career or living in India. And that story has been told so many times that I can visualize my father walking and auctioning the goods, and sometimes it incites emotions which are very painful. Sometimes it is just a way to encourage myself that yes, if he can do it, we can also struggle and pass these things.
Very enlightening, both the sessions. Just one thing I would like to add, that Swadesh Deepak's disintegration rather started 7 years earlier. He published a novel, Maya Poth, Phantom Ship. This was published 7 years earlier. And in that there is a doctor. She does some magic She does some witchcraft, and the protagonist is exactly like Swadesh Deepak, very robust and lots of things in that novel. But link, because here when doctor asks Swadesh Deepak in Calcutta, "Mere saath Mandu chalenge," then we can relate that doctor, because that doctor was already in Swadesh Deepak's mind for more than 7 years earlier. So, sir, thank you very much.
Anybody else has any question? Anything you, Dr. Kala, would like to add finally? No. Nimesh, as a co-chair.
Also, one or two big queries from on mind. You said very well in the episode narrative that you wish the parents of that period had somebody to talk to, if I got you right. My sense is that it's not as if they didn't have people to talk to. They had plenty of each other to talk to, but the socially constructed narrative was in that one direction. What would you say to that? Because I don't think there would have been lack of the semi-formal or informal support at that.
See, there were two things there. One was that they chose not to talk.
That I'll agree with, sure.
They chose not to talk. And secondly, there were actually no professionals to talk. Zero.
But that's what I'm referring to. That the semi-formal, informal support might actually work well. But your first point is well taken, very much.
So no, even the people who were available, a large number of them were refugees too, and also traumatized.
Sure.
And they had no connect with the people who were already living here.
That brings me to
just come in.
That brings me to any story, narrative, experiential account that will come close to Viktor Frankl's book from the partition time, Man in Search of Meaning. No, any positive account, self-experience that you are allowed to know.
There are a lot of self-experiences now online. There are partition, especially partition archives.47 run by Vinita Bulla. There are thousands of stories there now over the years. But the problem with those stories are they are just lying there in thousands. Nobody has categorized them, and only a historian can do it properly. And maybe it is probably also a very rich material for psychiatrists.
That's what I was talking about. Yeah. One more brief thing. You raised a very valid point that many of us, I'm sure, have pondered about. Is it necessary or helpful to be a bit psychotic, to paraphrase you at least, to be a successful creative writer? I mean, Ayn Rand, of course, some of our young colleagues might or might not remember, was a certified hospitalized paranoid schizophrenia, and both her greatest pieces came up after that, after moving to the US of A. Atlas Shrugged and Fountainhead. Not her first one, We the Living. In the end, Sudhir, I must say only one thing. Dr. Kala began very well about, again, with like humor, like with Dr. Akhtar, about how it is difficult or unfair to follow poetry with a narrative or prose. But I thought that, like one of those very popular desserts, I think we had a great helping of ebony and ivory both. I thought it was wonderful. Dr. Salman Akhtar's well-known style and your not at all meandering, serious but in-depth and sensitively felt. Really. Thanks to both of you today.
With that, we'll close this session. If organizers have any announcement to make, call us for tea or something. Finally.
I will just ask Dr. Rup Sirana to give a vote of thanks. And also, there is a book launch after this. So, of Dr. Salman Akhtar. And tea also is there. Yeah.
In between the two. Ye keh raha hu. Before the book launch, tea.
I think we've had a great day, and we must clap for both the speakers who have made us listen seriously and also made us not listened seriously, and we have gone through the journey. It was not a lecture, it was a journey which both these speakers have taken us from poetry to prose, and from partition to the present, and from literature to psychiatry and back to the literature and psychiatry, both back and forth. So from the task force of Indian Psychiatric Society, Literature and Psychiatry, I wish to express my gratitude and thanks to Dr. Salman, and give us this food for thought, food for emotions and feelings and knowledge. And I am grateful to Dr. Sudhir Khandelwal for being with us and moderating this session, and Dr. Nimesh Desai for being there on the chair. And thanks to the IPS office bearers, thanks to all the delegates who have been here listening silently and making this a great event. Thanks to all those people who are online, and we are sorry that we could not take their questions on because of the shortage of time. There were many of the people who are online listening to the whole meeting, and I'm thankful to the team Linex Pharma for giving us the being partner in our this knowledge pursuit, and thanks to my daughter Anida, who's been here as an anchor. And I request Dr. Salman Akhtar sir to please come on the dais. And एक सेकंड बस, आपको ये एसी कुछ ज्यादा चल गया है तो ठंड लग रही है लोगों को, तो आपको शॉल उड़ानी शॉल उड़ाकर आपका स्वागत कर। I request Dr. Sudhir Khandelwal to.
इतना तो हमें तो शादी में नहीं मिले थे मुझे। ये तो मौजूद है शादी में।
And a momento. Dr. Nimesh Desai.
ये मेरी बीवी को दे दें।
अच्छा, ये
शुक्रिया शुक्रिया। या अल्लाह, इतने तोहफे शादी में नहीं मिले। आस्था को मिले। ये बताओ, इतने लोग थे शादी ये भी वो भी शायद ना रहे।
आप जी शुरू करेंगे।
विनय कुमार जी, आप आ जाइए। आप सर
हो गया जी।
मोमेंटो दे। One momento for the chairpersons.
या अल्लाह, टीवी कम है, स्टाइरोफोम ज्यादा है।
सर आप भी आ जाइए।
ऐसा करेंगे,
आपको देना
उनको बुलाएं जिनको नहीं मिलने वाला है कुछ, क्यों वो लोग कम लग रहे हैं मुझे। उन तीनों को बुला लें जिनको
थैंक यू।
बिना किसी एजेंडा के
शुरू कर लो।
और शायरी भी तो अब चाय पीने के बाद हम लोग फिर से जमा होते हैं 10 मिनट के भीतर।